Okay, so I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's right on time. My clock says it's 2:15. So one of yes, Ken, these sessions will be available to be downloaded later. We don't necessarily provide them right away, but we will be posting them and sending out emails when they're available for download. So thank you for asking that question. For those who are still just joining, again, I want to keep this very collaborative. So any tips and tricks that anyone else wants to add as well, feel free to chime in the chat. One of the things as a consultant that, I don't know, I think that sometimes we get a little, we take certain things for granted when we start talking about things like data modeling and different analytics and things like that. And I wanted to really bring GIs back to basics for a lot of different people. I get questions all the time from different clients about, oh, I just want to add this one field, or I want to do this one thing, and I'm always reviewing some basic concepts. And I know, a lot of different ISVs, a lot of different people in the acumatica channel hear these terms like GIs, generic inquiries, being thrown around, and everyone's like, this is all foreign to me. So I just wanted to bring it back to basics again and sort of cover how to really work with GIs at a very basic level, and just how to essentially not break stuff too. I've seen a lot of clients go in and start trying to modify things with generic inquiries, and things just can quickly go awry if you don't really know the basics. So if you guys should all be able to see my screen. And right now I'm looking at the sales orders primary list. Now, one of the most very basic things is that we all kind of throw around these things where we say, oh, GIs are everywhere in Acumatica, but how do I really know what is a GI and what isn't? A lot of times I get requests from clients, they'll pull up a specific screen and they'll be like, well, that's a GI, isn't it? And I'm like, no, that's not even a GI. Just because it's a grid doesn't mean it's a GI. So one of the very easy things to do whenever you're in one of these screens is, if you have the appropriate security rights, if you're an admin, if you're someone who has rights to get into modifying GIs, you'll notice if I'm on something like the sales orders primary list, I'll have this customization menu. Again, that is depending on your security rights in Acumatica. But if I have this customization menu and what I immediately see is edit generic inquiry, that is a generic inquiry or a GI. If I look at other things, and sometimes Acumatica can be a little bit, they provide so much information. There's so many different screens, so many different options, which is great. But if I'm looking at something like customer details, you'll notice on my menu I have a customer details here, which is under data views and inquiries. But there's also a customer details here as well under receivables, right? If I look at this particular customer details screen, while it's under the inquiries menu, if I look at that customization menu, I don't see an edit generic inquiry because this is an actual screen that's programmed inside of Acumatica. These things are able to be modified, but with a customization project, not simply by just going into the generic inquiry editor and editing things in the generic inquiry. So a lot of times, exactly. Thanks, Tim. So a lot of times that's the easiest way to really tell if you're working with a GI or not, again, depending on your security rights. And again, if I go into something like customer details here under data views inquiries, you'll notice that under customization, it brings me to edit generic inquiry and also pivot tables. It's important to note, too, that generic inquiries are really the basis for so much of what we do in Acumatica, and that's why you'll hear the term being thrown around a lot. Most generic inquiries, you'll see a lot of those things when you click on data views. You'll see a ton of generic inquiries there, especially if you're a user and you've been working with your consultants. There may be even more that you see under data views. chances are all of these things under data views are most likely going to all be GIs, right? The other place that GIs are really used are, if you're using Acumatica and you have various different dashboards, the GIs are really the basis for a lot of those dashboards in the system. So if I look at this particular customer view dashboard and I click on one of those particular tiles, that's going to bring me to a GI. You can also kind of tell most times based on your screen ID if it says something like GI in it, or if you're again in the sales orders primary list. This as well, any of these screen IDs where you're immediately going into a primary list, these in most instances are all generic inquiries. And again, you can see that here from the edit generic inquiry menu. One thing I'm probably going to say this several times over the next half an hour, is that if you are looking to make some modifications to primary lists, be the most cautious with doing that, right? Because remember that most of your users are going to click on the sales order menu and then they're going straight into a generic inquiry in order to see that. If you really mess up that generic inquiry and that generic inquiry does not return any data, many of your common sales order users are not going to know exactly how to get back to their sales orders. It is nice that Acumatica has added the ability to just go straight into a new sales order, but people who aren't familiar with how the system works, if you break that primary list, they're going to immediately go, hey, we can't enter sales orders. So it's happened on more occasions than I can count where people go in and edit those primary lists, and then they have a whole sales staff of 20 people going, I can't find my orders. Okay, so especially if you're going to be working with modifying those primary lists, proceed with caution. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to do that exactly. Okay, so in this instance, I'm going to take this sales order primary list and I'm going to start out by just adding a few fields to it and talk about how that works from a very basic level. Now, again, speaking to my previous cautionary warning about modifying the primary list, I will say that if you're just adding a few fields that are already available in the existing tables that are in that generic inquiry, it's probably going to be safe to just add a field or two. Where things really start to go awry is when you start adding other tables, you try doing table linking, and you're not really sure what you're doing. So in this sales order primary list, I'm going to start out by, again, adding a couple of fields. And especially if you're not someone who's super comfortable with what you're doing, always just double check your column configurator in Acumatica and make sure the fields aren't already there and you're just not seeing it. Just double check to see what you have available as available columns. But I'm going to go into edit generic inquiry and talk a little bit about how this works. So you'll notice here on the generic inquiry editing screen, on my first tab here, I have all of the tables that are available in this GI already. Copying a GI and creating a new one is as simple as, using your little clipboard tool. You should all be familiar with that. But you can come in here and do copy and add that to, I can create a new one, give it a new title, like Nicole test, whatever I want to call it. And then paste all of that setup from there. I will make a note too that as you're working with this, you'll notice a few things up here, one of which is make visible on the UI. If I'm creating one as a test and I just want one to monkey around with and work with, I like to turn this off because I don't want any of my users to get into that accidentally or see that GI while I'm still in the process of crafting it. Okay, so I'm going to hit save here just to get this going. And I am working on a local host instance of Acumatica, so hopefully my computer stays chugging along. you'll notice down here all of the different tables. Sometimes even just that can be overwhelming for people. Just kind of, they get in, they start seeing the screen, they're like, I don't know what I'm looking at. If you're even remotely familiar with doing things like Excel queries or anything else, these are really what we call the data access classes, but they're really just the tables that are in the database for pulling the data. In a lot of times when people are looking at adding just a few fields to a generic inquiry, those fields may all already be available within those tables that are already crafted in this generic inquiry that we're working with, right? So just running through some of these tabs just to give you a quick overview of what these tabs are and what they mean. Again, these are the tables. I'll get into adding related tables and other tables in a minute. But these are the tables that are currently available. So we have the customer, the business account, the branch, and the order. There's Tim made a good point too about using the hidden workspace to keep things that are working on a secret. That's a good point too. We always try to keep things a little bit, under wraps before people can see them. So that's a good point, that you can always make it visible on the UI and then put it in a hidden workspace as well. If I look at the relations, I think that relations is oftentimes where people get a little bit confused as to what exactly this means. But really, these are just the joins between the tables that you're pulling into this query, this generic inquiry, right? So because we're working with one that has already been created and we're just working with a copy, then I'm not going to get too deep into that quite yet, but we will talk about that a little bit more once we add a new table to this query. And acuCONNECT has also provided some new features in most recent versions for making this a little bit easier. Parameters are something that is if you want to add like a runtime parameter to the GI. I would say probably the majority of the GIs that you see within acuCONNECT that come stock don't really have too many parameters on them, but many of them do. I think I have one here. I think the other customer details screen here has one. So this would be what a parameter would look like on a generic inquiry, right? So this is a generic inquiry screen, but this has a parameter on it. And if we looked at the definition of that generic inquiry, that would be configured with a parameter that is optional, where you either are seeing all of the customers or you're seeing just the customer that you fill in that parameter. So you have that ability within a generic inquiry to create those types of parameters. Okay, this one that I'm building, I'm not going to build any parameters at this point. You can also add in conditions. Those conditions that you put into the generic inquiry could be something along the lines of, maybe I want to pre-filter on this GI what the order status is. So maybe on this new GI that I'm building, I want to just look at the status field of the order. So I'm going to pick SO order status, and I'm going to say equals, and I'm going to say from schema, because that means I'm going to look at the definitions that are in the database and pull a value of what I want to show for this particular GI, right? So in this instance, I'm just going to say, okay, we're building something that's just showing me open sales orders, right? So that's what I get there. If I were to uncheck this from schema, you would have to put in the actual value that's in the database, and sometimes people don't understand those things. So if you have that from schema option, I would most certainly recommend to try to pull it from schema so that you know exactly what that value is that you're filtering on. Because in this instance too, like an open order is N. You know, these are things that if you're a novice user, you wouldn't necessarily know all of that information. And I with anything in Acumatica, whenever I'm editing, I always advise people save early, saved often. I like to periodically save as I'm going through and editing these things, especially if I'm in an area where I'm not comfortable. I like to save as soon as I've made changes that I know I'm comfortable with. There's also a grouping option as well. So if I was pulling in a lot of detail line information and I need to do some sort of summing or anything else, you can do a level of grouping within Acumatica. I would say that if you are a novice user of generic inquiries, I would proceed with caution when doing grouping until you understand some more advanced concepts that we're probably going to get into today, because you'll need to understand things like how to do summing and aggregate functions like that. You also have the ability to modify the sort order, the default sort order of what displays within that GI. Again, this is the default sort order. Obviously, if you've seen a generic inquiry, you've used Acumatica, you know the users can change their sort when they're viewing that screen. This would just be the default sort order that's being used when the GI first appears on the screen. And really where the main magic action happens in a GI is the results grid. Especially if you're building one from scratch or you're modifying an existing one, the results grid is really going to be everything that's returned to the user on the screen. Okay. Now, these objects, again, are tables that we saw in the main screen. And then whatever fields we're choosing in order to display on that GI. In this example GI that I have, I'm only looking at things from the SO order table itself, but I'm going to just kind of go through the exercise of how would I know how to add a field and what fields I'm even looking for. Because those of you who are familiar with working with Acumatica and maybe from a data standpoint, you know that the field as it's called on the screen is not always what it's called in the database either. That's pretty standard for any software. They name things differently on the screen than they do in the database, and sometimes it's pretty tricky for users to find what exactly they're looking for. The great thing about Acumatica, and I'm just going to pop over into an example sales order. The really great thing about Acumatica, and the biggest thing that I'm always using, no matter how comfortable or familiar I feel with the tables, I always use what's called inspect element. It's huge, right? So what inspect element allows you to do is if I click on the inspect element tool, if you can see my screen, sorry, I had bad eyesight, I had to zoom in there for myself. You should see that there's a little question mark that is displayed. And then I can go through the screen and sort of click on fields that I want to add to my GI. So let's say on this order on my GI, I want to add, maybe I'm using project accounting and I want to add the project ID. I can click on that field and it's going to come up with this element properties. Okay, so in this instance, I'm looking at this data class, which if you remember from what I told you before, data classes are really like our tables that are in the database. So this is looking at data class SO order, which I can go, cool, I know I already have SO order in my GI. I don't have to add another table. And then I can also see that actual field name, which in this case is a pretty simple one, which is project ID. As many of you know, once you learn that field name in this particular table, don't take it for granted that project ID is always going to be called project ID either. Always take the course of action to pull up the screen, use inspect element, and verify what that field name is. Especially with something like projects, in certain tables in Acumatica, projects are referred to as project ID. It may be referred to as contract ID. So always a good idea to pull up the screen, use inspect element, and verify exactly what you're looking for. So in this case, I'm looking at SO order and the project ID. If I want, I can keep using this to identify other things such as, requested on is request date. If I want to look at customer order, this is customer order number. Same thing with external reference. This is customer ref number. Okay, so again, just sort of illustrating that it's always a good idea to click on those fields and use inspect element and see exactly what you're looking for. Okay. I'm also going to highlight another field here as well, and I'm going to do customization and inspect element, and I want to also add this like unpaid balance. Okay, so in this instance, I see that this field is called current unpaid balance. So now that I've kind of gotten a list together, I know what fields I want to add to this GI. And I was kind of joking with Amma a little bit before. Usually when I'm doing things like this, I have two screens and I have two windows open where I have my actual entry screen where I can click and do the inspect element, and then on my second monitor I'll be actually editing the GI. I'm just kind of flipping back and forth. Just need to get a third monitor so I can do all of this at one time, but that's okay. So back on my results grid, I want to add a couple of those fields in order to add that data to my screen. So when I hit the plus sign in this results grid, it automatically picks SO order. Coincidentally, that's everything I'm going to be pulling into this GI, but you can see here that I can also pull things from other places, right? So if I wanted to look at specific data from the customer record or the branch or the business account, I could pull things from those tables as well. I would be determining that based on using the inspect element and seeing exactly where I want to pull the data from. So on SO order, and again, I actually like to sometimes even just cheat, and I'll do inspect element like this, and then I'll just copy and then go back into my GI and paste that right there. And that will give me that field. So whether you have those fields memorized or know all of them, whether it be customer order number, customer ref number, and even something like project ID, can put that all in there. Now, a couple of things on here too is that, and some of these are new, I would say newer to Acumatica, past couple of versions. You do have the ability to, once you've made those changes, you can click on View Inquiry here, or there's also the eyeball that you can click here to do a little bit of a preview to see what your generic inquiry edits look like. So I can see here that I have that customer order number, I have external reference number that I've added, the unpaid balance of that particular order. You can also pop this thing out to that square that was up there in the corner, or shrink it back down. I still have a hard time using the eyeball because for the longest time we didn't have that little preview thing. So I do still use the view inquiry quite a lot. I'm also curious too, Tim, what other people think. I don't know. I don't know if it's just force of habit, because I'm so used to clicking on view inquiry. I also I try to make myself use the eyeball. I keep trying to make myself use it, but I tend to still click on this view inquiry button. I don't know if it's just you can't teach an old dog new tricks or what, but most times I'm clicking on view inquiry still. Yeah, exactly, Christy and Tim. I think some of it's just a force of habit, you know. So a couple of other things I want to cover on this, basics of GI session as well is, let's say I am using something like project accounting and I want to actually add information from the project itself. So I can go back over to my tables, and I want to shrink that up. So I'm going to go back over to my tables here. And let's say I click on SO order because I know that there's a reference to the project in particular on SO order itself. And let's say I want to add more data from the project's table into this generic inquiry. So I can actually click now, and this is a newer feature that they added. I think it was 2021 R1. Maybe, I can't remember exactly. Acumatica is always coming out with so many new things. It's hard to keep straight like which version stuff was added. But I'm going to click on SO order and I'm going to click on add related table. Now, again, I could bounce out of here, go into the project screen to look for particular things that I'm looking to add. I would, again, be using that inspect element tool in order to determine what exactly I wanted to see, but I really know that I want to add the PM project table. So I'm clicking on add related table because this is a nice newer feature that acu-connect has added to the generic inquiries to make things a little bit easier for users. I would say that in most instances, you can use this related table screen to add these related tables without having to do a ton of different research as to what you're looking for. So I can look at this list here and I know I'm looking for projects and I see PM project here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the PM project and click on select related table. And you'll see that here in this relation portion, it's putting in the table join for me automatically. Now, I think that this is sometimes where people, when we start talking about things like table joins and everything else, there's certain users who might not feel technical and they start getting like, oh, what is she saying about table joins? This is so confusing. So I'm going, thanks Dim, 2020 R2. So I clicked that and added that, and you'll see it added that table here to my table screen. And if I bounce over to the relations, you'll also notice that it added this as well to our table relations. It added a join. Now, this is also another thing that I'm going to give you a little bit of a precursory word of advice that as you're going through, especially when you're adding tables, this is where things can go wrong. And especially people who are not familiar with how table joins work, these ideas of things like inner joins, left joins, right joins can be really confusing. Do I have I think I have a little graphic here just to sort of show people. So this is kind of just a little bit of a graphic to illustrate to those who are not familiar with what table joins even mean, just to give you a simple overview of different join types and the join types that are available in Acumatica. When you're using that add related table button, it's going to automatically add things as an inner join. I would say in many instances, you're probably going to be looking at wanting to maybe change that to a left join. What the join types mean is that when you're relating two different tables to each other in something like an inner join, it's only going to return the rows that are equal between those two tables where those things match, right? So if I'm joining projects and customer or projects and orders, it's going to find a project record for every single sales order. And if there's no match between those two things, it's not going to return any values. Again, concepts like these can get, and Tim said, tend to use left join 90% of the time. Personally, I would 100% agree with that 90% of the time statement. So just understand that based on those join types that you could return different amounts of records based on picking the wrong join type. And I do get a little bit nervous with the add related tables where it always adds everything as an inner join. In this case with SO order and PM project, it really does not matter. It's going to return the correct records regardless. But for sake of safety, again, like sticking with the inner join, or sorry, the left join, because that always makes the most sense. And you'll see here, down here too, it also did the data fields that it's using to link those two records. And this, again, is a good example of what goes on with inspect element, understanding those field names and the joins, because if we look at SO order and PM project, the field in SO order is called project ID. In PM project, that same field is contract ID. Okay. Now I can go back to my results grid and start pulling in information from the project. Am I coming up on time? Who's my monitor? I talk way too much. I have like 1 minute now?
You do, yeah.
So one further tip, and I'm probably just going to run like a minute or two over, but I'm president, so here it goes. If I want to add things from my project, a lot of times, in your Acumatica system, you're going to have things like attributes, perhaps. So in my system currently, I have some attributes on the project. So if I look at PM project and I want to add some of my attribute fields from that particular project, I can scroll through here, and most times with attributes, you'll see things where it'll say like burden_attributes. That's coming from an attribute field. Now, one of the biggest things I find with users too is that they don't understand, how do I know what that attribute ID is called, right? Because if I look at my projects themselves, I'm just going to go in here really quick, and then I'm going to try so hard to wrap up. I can't help it. I'm a talker. So from a user standpoint, when you look at something like projects, you're going to see all these different attributes, but you don't know what those attribute IDs are or how to refer to them in generic inquiries. So it's really simple to just, in your Acumatica system, search for the actual attributes screen, and that could be project attributes or attributes. I'm not going to get too deep into that because I'm short on time. But you'll see here under my project attributes, that's where I can find those individual attribute IDs. So whether those are actual attributes on a project or a customer, or they're attributes as in what we call user-defined fields on something like a sales order, it's really important to go into the attributes maintenance, find that attribute ID so that you can pull the appropriate attribute into your generic inquiry. So again, this is all just pretty basic stuff when it comes to generic inquiries, but I wanted to make sure I gave you guys kind of an overview as to just some very simple edits that you can do. Again, these are not things like data modeling that we're talking about with data self or some of the more advanced things that Tim showed, but these are just some basic tips and tricks as far as, how to do inspect element, how to, add some basic fields to screens without having to call your consultants for help. And tomorrow we will, Mike Notley from iTech and I will be having a session on advanced GI tips and tricks where we're going to be talking about some navigations and actions and things like that. So hope everybody can join us tomorrow and you stick with us through the rest of the day today, and hope to see you all at the happy hour.